Well, like John Rumrich, I have John Kerry's brief essay in the Times Literary Supplement, at least partly in mind. As many of you may know, Kerry raises the specter of the suicide bomber in front of us so that we can embrace his reading of Samson Agonistes, which has the shortcoming of being incorrect. Now, I'm more interested in criticism than ghost story, so I'm going to open up the category of the suicide bomber critically in a brief excursus that I've called, with the obvious nod to Gayatri Spivak, Can the Suicide Bomber Speak? We have all by now become familiar with and rejected the trite aphorism, one person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter, which offers little insight on terrorism and engages in an unthinking relativism. While not as catchy, one could sooner countenance one person's terrorist who is also another's freedom fighter should be every person's murderer. But the double possessive of the trite aphorism does offer one important insight. The life of the terrorist is always already written, particularly in the case of the suicide attacker, whose final action is not self-expression, so much as a radical self-effacement on which the order of narrative is imposed. That this attacker leaves behind evidence of an active adoption of that narrative, the obligatory letter or video denouncing infidels and anticipating celestial reward, should not fool us into thinking that it constitutes entire fulfillment of his wishes. To think that it does is to take subjectivization to be subjectivity. As Gayatri Spivak describes it, the training of the suicide bomber is coercion at the full. Groups such as Hamas or Islamic Jihad coercively rearrange desires until coercion seems identical with the will of the coerced. For our part, we should be reluctant, as Talal Esed has shown, to claim knowledge of the suicide bomber's motives, and bear in mind that explanations in terms of motives depend on typologies of action that are conventionally recognized. To put it in theory speak, the self-immolation of the suicide bomber creates an aporia that narrative conventions of cause and effect can supplement but never fill. If I emphasize such problems of articulation and somewhat grudgingly repair to some of the most worn of theoretical terms, aporia and supplement, it is because so much of the critical controversy surrounding Samson Agonistes revolves around a silence, the absence of Samson's prayer immediately before he pulls down the pillars of the temple of Dagon. It is on this silence that the apologist critics striving to make this a text opposed to the idea of divinely inspired slaughter typically project Samson's alterity and Milton's ipseity. The claim often repeated is that eliminating Samson's vengeful prayer, I pray thee only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes, it's Judges 16, suggests that the strength allowing him to commit his final act does not arise from God. On the evidence of this silence, John Kerry suggests that perhaps he prays, perhaps not. Where the Judge's account clearly implies that God is involved, Milton shrouds this moment in ambiguity. While Kerry intends to question the dogmatism of Stanley Fish's reading of Samson Agonistes, his view of the poem engages in its own dogmatic imposition of ambiguity, as does Joseph Whitrick's closed claim that to equivocate on Samson's prayer is to equivocate on Samson's heroism. That happens to be untrue. An ambivalent or even negative view of Samson's prayer is not necessarily a denial of divine involvement in his final act. In the Institutes, Calvin objects to Samson's vicious longing for vengeance, but maintains that God grants his perverted prayer. There is also no evidence within Milton's dramatic poem that removal of the prayer serves the ends that Kerry and Whitrick describe. In adopting their view, we must see that removal as motivated by a discomfort with Samson's final act and exploit the opportunity of the suicide attacker's silence to advance our own cultural narrative, which would have Milton impregnate this pause with the objection to mass slaughter that a sensitive poet must have. I would argue that this moment emphasizes, rather than diminishes, the divine inspiration of Samson's final triumph. In handling his Hebrew Bible source, Milton imposes a silence, allowing for more effective deployment of this hero of faith in the larger narrative that he advances. God's special regard for his saints and execution of justice upon his idolatrous enemies, be they the flower of Palestine or of Restoration England. Milton rewrites his biblical source to bring it more fully into accord with his view of biblical history and his own moment therein. He removes the human motivation of revenge for personal injury and emphasizes an objection to Philistine idolatry, an attunement to divine will, and an anticipation of the apocalypse. In this respect, Milton's Samson shares features with the view of Jesus that emerges over his entire poetic career, from the Nativity Ode to Paradise Regained, which tends to overlook the suffering on the cross in favor of the larger cosmic significance of Christ's arrival. At the moment of his triumph, Milton's Samson is much less a human subject than he is a vessel of God's wrath. What's more, our own moment reveals that this silencing of personal motives is typical of the culture seeking to immortalize those self-sacrificing militants who, like Milton's Samson, are distanced from suicide. Among Tamil Tigers, the secular movement that is the world leader in suicide attack, the term Thapkodai, gift of the self, is used rather than Thapkolai, suicide. The Palestinian shaheed, or martyr, is etymologically associated with the verb shahada, to witness, and shahada, which means tombstone, and refers to the sign of the index finger extended upward, the one-way sign, representing exclusive focus on things heavenly. True to this suite of meanings, martyr memorials in Palestine never show physical injuries and emphasize divine service and reward. These memorials also conflate those innocently killed with those who die whilst killing. As in Hebrews 11, Abel's and Enoch's rest alongside Gideon's and Samson's. Milton's quiet Samson completes this conflation, reaching across his three major poems, which claim over and again that divine favor is bestowed upon those who set aside worldly motives in God's service, that spiritual supersedes physical sight, and that the destruction of worldly inequity is inevitable.